long before the first sunrise painted the eastern horizon, before mountains lifted their stone faces toward heaven, before rivers carved their ancient paths through fertile valleys, there existed only the primordial silence. This was not mere absence of sound, but the profound stillness that held all potential within its vast embrace. A universal pause before the first word would shatter eternity and bring forth the world. In this time, before time, the sky sea stretched endlessly in all directions, neither fully water nor completely air, but something luminous and fluid that defied the categories mortals would later devise. Above this tranquil expanse, the dome of heaven arched in crystalline perfection, transparent as the clearest jade, yet strong as the hardest obsidian. Through its heavenly vault, no stars yet gleamed, for the universal order that would govern day and night, season and calendar, remained unborn. Within this pregnant void, consciousness stirred, not the fragmented awareness of individual creatures, but the unified intelligence of reality itself, immortal minds contemplating the holy act of making. Here dwelt the makers, Tepo, Guchumats, and Huracan, whose very names would become synonymous with the power to speak reality into being. Tepo, the sovereign plumed serpent, embodied the principle of ordered beauty, the universal intelligence that would establish harmony between all created things. His essence shimmered with the iridescent colors of the Quetzal bird, each feather a potential world, each movement a universe waiting to unfold. Guchumats, the feathered serpent of the waters, represented the creative force that moves through all things, the celestial wind that would breathe life into clay and consciousness into matter. His coils encompassed both the sky sea above and the waters below, bridging realms that mortals would perceive as separate. Huracan, the heart of sky, pulsed with the rhythm of universal storms, the heavenly tempest that would both destroy and create, clearing away the imperfect to make space for the sublime. He was the blessed lightning that illuminates darkness, the thunder that calls forth rain, the cyclone that clears the heavenly field for new growth. These three immortal consciousnesses existed in perfect unity, their separate identities merely facets of a single creative will. When they spoke, their voices harmonized like the most exquisite celestial music, each word a note in the symphony of making. The first celestial deliberation concerned the fundamental architecture of reality. "Let there be place," spoke Tepo, and his words rippled through the sky sea like stones cast into still water. "Let there be foundation for all that will stand, all that will grow, all that will move in its appointed time." "Let there be separation," added Guchumats, his voice carrying the authority of ancient understanding. "Let the waters find their boundaries. Let the sky discover its domain. Let ground emerge from the marriage of these elements." "Let there be the four directions," thundered Huracan, and with his pronouncement, the undifferentiated void suddenly knew orientation. East and west, north and south sprang into reality, establishing the universal cross that would become the blessed geometry underlying all making. The world tree took root in this moment, its massive trunk extending from the deepest foundations of the realm, through all the layered spheres of reality to the highest peak of heaven. This was no ordinary tree, but the axis of making itself, the universal spine around which all worlds would revolve. Its roots penetrated the underworld domains where spirits dwelt. Its trunk supported the middle realm where mortal existence would flourish, and its crown touched the celestial sphere where the makers held council. At the cardinal points surrounding this central axis, the heavenly architects established the fundamental directions that would govern all movement and meaning. Red marked the east, realm of dawn and new beginnings. White sanctified the north, domain of understanding and ancestral memory. Black claimed the West, territory of endings and transformation. Yellow hallowed the South, region of abundance and maturity. Let the ground emerge, they declared in unison, and their combined will penetrated the sky sea like heavenly lightning. Mountains lifted their proud heads above the receding waters, their peaks scraping the belly of the sky. Valleys opened like cupped hands, ready to receive the gifts of heaven. Rich soil accumulated in these protected spaces, black loam so fertile that the makers themselves marveled at its potential. Springs bubbled up from hidden sources, gathering into streams that joined to become rivers, carving their ancient highways toward the distant sea. With the stage prepared, the makers turned their creative attention to populating their masterpiece with animated forms. They began with the creatures who would serve as guardians and messengers, forms whose very reality would maintain the delicate balance among the various spheres of making. The deer emerged first, graceful forms whose swift legs would carry blessed messages across vast distances. The jaguars received the honor of ruling the night, their spotted coats mirror images of the starry sky above. The serpents became the living representatives of celestial understanding, their sinuous forms echoing the movement of water and wind. The birds filled the air with music and meaning. Each species assigned its own particular message to carry among the realms. Countless other creatures emerged from the immortal imagination. The wise owl, who would see clearly in darkness. The industrious ant, who would teach the value of community effort. The colorful butterfly, who would demonstrate the beauty of transformation. Each animal received specific gifts, particular responsibilities, and blessed roles in maintaining the universal order. Having populated their making with magnificent animated forms, the makers gathered to witness the crucial test that would determine these creatures' ultimate destiny. This was the moment when reality would reveal whether it possessed the one quality the makers valued above all others: the ability to recognize and honor its creators. "Speak, our children," commanded Tapio, his language reaching every valley and hilltop, every forest glade and mountain cave. "Call upon our names, for we who have given you vitality deserve your acknowledgement and praise. Let your voices rise like incense smoke to the heavens," thundered Huracan. "We have made you to be our remembrances, our living testament to the power of immortal making." The animals stirred in response to this celestial summons. The deer lifted their elegant heads, but instead of language, only soft breathing emerged. The jaguars paced restlessly, yet when they attempted speech, only deep purrs and rumbling growls issued from their throats. The birds opened their beaks wide, and beautiful songs poured forth, melodies of exquisite beauty. Yet these were still only songs, not the articulate speech the makers required. Each creature demonstrated understanding in its own way, gathering around the blessed places, arranging themselves in patterns that suggested worship. Yet for all their understanding and beauty, none possessed the specific gift the makers sought: the ability to form spoken language, to speak names, to offer verbal praise and thanksgiving. "They cannot speak our names," observed Tapio with deep sadness. "Without speech, they cannot preserve the memory of our making. Without spoken language, they cannot tell the stories that connect past to future." The judgment pronounced upon the animals was both just and merciful. "You shall serve as food for those who come after," declared the makers, their combined voice carrying both sorrow and necessity. "Your flesh shall nourish the bodies of future creatures, yet you shall be honored in the taking, remembered in the eating, celebrated in the ceremonies that surround your sacrifice." This was the first great lesson in the universal balance that would govern all future making. Energy sustained through energy, reality made possible by willing sacrifice, the eternal circulation of force that connects all forms in an unbreakable web of mutual dependence. Having established the animal kingdom with its proper role and limitations, the celestial architects turned their attention to the supreme challenge, forming entities capable of the speech, memory, and gratitude that would make them worthy companions and remembrancers of the Makers. The first attempt began with the most abundant material available, the rich, dark soil that formed the foundation of their realm. The Makers gathered clay from the banks of blessed rivers and began to shape humanoid forms with infinite care. These first humans emerged beautiful to behold, their features perfectly proportioned, their limbs gracefully arranged. Yet almost immediately, fundamental flaws became apparent. The mud folk possessed no structural integrity. Their bodies began to sag and deform as soon as they attempted to stand. Their faces blurred and ran like watercolors in rain. When they tried to speak, their language emerged as unintelligible mumbles. Most tragically, their minds proved as unstable as their bodies, thoughts forming briefly only to dissolve before reaching completion. The Makers watched with growing dismay as these first human forms literally melted away, their carefully crafted bodies returning to undifferentiated clay. Clay alone is insufficient, concluded Poe, with profound regret. Though it can be shaped to resemble vitality, it lacks the internal structure necessary to maintain that shape. Learning from this initial failure, the Makers sought a more durable material for their second attempt. From the finest trees in their making, cedar for strength, oak for endurance, pine for flexibility, they carved a new generation of human forms. These timber folk possessed remarkable durability, maintaining perfect proportions regardless of wind or rain. They could walk without sagging, run without collapsing, work without dissolving. The carved folk also demonstrated significant intellectual advancement. They possessed stable memories, accumulated experiences, developed skills. They built houses, crafted tools, established communities. They even mastered a crude form of speech, though their voices carried the hollow sound of wind through empty branches. For a time, it appeared that the Makers had achieved success. The timber folk spread across the ground, multiplying rapidly, filling valleys and hillsides with their settlements. They learned to cultivate crops, domesticate animals, fashion art and music. Their civilization developed sophisticated technologies, complex social structures, impressive architectural achievements. Yet a crucial flaw undermined all these apparent successes. The carved folk possessed no souls, no spark of celestial consciousness that would connect them to their Makers. Their hearts beat with mechanical regularity, but felt no genuine emotion. Their minds remained focused entirely on material concerns, showing no inclination toward worship, no capacity for gratitude, no recognition of the immortal source of their reality. Worse still, their soullessness manifested as growing arrogance and cruelty. They treated the animals not as fellow creatures deserving respect, but as mere objects to be exploited. They showed no reverence for the blessed places, no appreciation for natural abundance. Their relationship with the realm became one of domination rather than stewardship. The Makers watched with mounting anger as their timber folk persisted in this pattern of ungrateful exploitation. The moment arrived when universal justice demanded correction of this fundamental imbalance. Yet the Makers chose not to destroy the carved folk directly. Instead, they allowed the timber folk's own choices to generate the instruments of their destruction. The rebellion began in the very objects the carved folk had crafted and used without gratitude or respect. The grinding stones suddenly developed consciousness and voice. "You have made us suffer," they declared, their voices grating with accumulated resentment. "Day after day, you have crushed corn upon our surfaces, yet never once acknowledged our service or showed us the smallest gratitude." The cooking pots joined this uprising with their own accusations. "We have held your food, contained your water, endured the heat of flames to serve your needs, yet you have treated us as if we were insensate objects, incapable of feeling or deserving respect." The rebellion spread to encompass every tool and utensil the carved folk had fashioned. Axes turned against their wielders, knives cut their owners, hammers struck the hands that had held them. The very houses they had built collapsed upon them, their wooden beams and stone foundations crying out in unified protest. As if the rebellion of inanimate objects were insufficient punishment, the timber folk faced additional celestial judgments. Huracan summoned a great black rain that fell with the force of universal anger, crushing their houses and warping their heartwood bodies until they became grotesque parodies of human appearance. With the rain came consuming fire that reduced entire cities to ash in moments. The blessed jaguars received celestial permission to hunt the timber folk without restriction, emerging from forest depths with supernatural speed and strength. The carved folk proved helpless against this coordinated assault. Those who survived fled in panic to remote forests, where they underwent a gradual transformation that reflected their changed understanding. Their features coarsened and distorted, their voices devolved into chattering and howling, their consciousness simplified until only basic survival instincts remained. These transformed carved folk became the monkeys, living reminders of the consequences of ingratitude and arrogance. Their fate served as a perpetual warning. Those who forget their immortal origins, who fail to acknowledge their universal debt, risk losing the very qualities that elevated them above the beasts. The makers looked upon these transformed forms with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, universal balance had been restored, yet the necessity of this punishment reminded the creators that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. Forming entities capable of maintaining the delicate balance, linking intelligence and humility, capability and gratitude. As the smoke cleared from the destruction, the makers gathered once more in council to contemplate their next creative effort. "Twice we have attempted to fashion suitable companions," reflected Poe. "Twice our efforts have revealed unforeseen limitations. Perhaps the making of conscious, grateful forms requires methods and materials we have not yet considered." The Immortal Council reached a momentous decision. They would pause in their human-making efforts to allow time for deeper contemplation and preparation. During this interim period, they would observe their existing reality more closely, studying successful aspects of animal vitality, analyzing lessons learned from their failed attempts, exploring new possibilities for bridging the gap, linking mortal reality and celestial consciousness. Meanwhile, the realm they had fashioned continued to flourish under their benevolent care. The animals thrived in their assigned roles. The plants grew in abundance. The waters flowed clean and sweet. The mountains stood firm in their appointed places. Yet despite this magnificent beauty, an essential emptiness remained. The makers had fashioned a realm capable of supporting conscious, grateful forms, but conscious, grateful forms themselves remained elusive. This was the universal situation as the first age of making drew to its close. A realm of perfect function, populated with countless forms of vitality, yet still lacking the entities who could fully appreciate its wonders and properly honor its creators. The makers waited, their infinite patience matched by their unwavering determination, knowing that the answer to their greatest challenge lay somewhere in the vast realm of creative possibility that stretched before them. The stage was set for the next chapter in this universal drama, a chapter that would introduce new immortal actors, new heavenly realms, and new challenges that would test not only the makers' creative abilities, but also their commitment to the principle that conscious forms must earn their place in reality through trials that reveal their true character and ultimate destiny. While the makers contemplated their next attempt at fashioning grateful beings, the architecture of reality required completion. The middle sphere where humans would eventually dwell had been established. The celestial dome where immortals held council stretched overhead, but the third domain of existence remained unformed. The deep places beneath the foundation of the world, where shadow met substance and endings transformed into new beginnings. This was the place of testing, whose name whispered of fear and reverence in equal measure. Not merely a destination for the deceased, but a living domain of examination and metamorphosis, where spirits faced challenges that would determine their ultimate nature. Here, in caverns that stretched beyond human comprehension, through passages that defied earthly geometry, the masters of the final mystery maintained their own complex civilization, as elaborate and structured as any surface kingdom. The descent into this shadow domain began where the roots of the world tree penetrated deepest, where underground rivers flowed with waters that had never known sunlight. These were not the gentle streams that nourished surface vegetation, but torrents of primal force that carried the essence of change itself. To drink from these waters meant to abandon forever the simple certainties of earthly existence, to embrace the fundamental truth that all apparent endings were merely doorways to new forms of being. The very geography of this netherworld reflected its dual nature as place of termination and renewal. 13 levels descended from the surface, each deeper than the last, each presenting its own particular challenges to any spirit, brave or foolish enough to attempt the journey. Yet the careful observer would notice that these levels formed not a simple descent, but a great spiral, eventually returning to connect with the 13 layers of heaven above. Endings and births revealed themselves as parts of a single continuous process, like a serpent swallowing its own tail in the eternal cycle of existence. At the heart of this labyrinthine domain stood the palace of the shadow rulers, a structure that defied human understanding of architecture. Its walls seemed to breathe with living darkness. Its corridors shifted and changed according to no earthly logic. Its chambers expanded or contracted based on the intentions of those who entered. This was not random chaos, but a deeper order, one that responded to the spiritual state of visitors rather than their physical actions. Here ruled the masters of the final mystery, beings whose authority extended over the moment when breath ceased and consciousness prepared for its next transformation. Chief among these was one Death, whose very presence reminded all who encountered him that every heartbeat brought living creatures closer to their inevitable appointment with his domain. His counterpart, Seven Death, embodied the truth that endings came in countless forms, through age, accident, illness, violence, or simply the natural completion of life's appointed cycle. These supreme sovereigns of the shadow realm commanded legions of lesser spirits, each specializing in particular aspects of life's conclusion. Blood-gatherer presided over wounds and hemorrhaging, his skeletal fingers eternally stained crimson, with the vital force he collected from battlefields and accident sites. Pus Master governed infection and disease, his putrid breath capable of corrupting the healthiest flesh. Wing, perhaps most terrifying of all, struck without warning, his invisible presence causing sudden termination among those who believed themselves safe from harm. Packstrap and Bone Staff served as the ruler's primary messengers, capable of traveling instantly between the netherworld and surface sphere to deliver summons that no living being could refuse. Their arrival in any community meant that someone's time had arrived, though they often cloaked their true purpose in apparent coincidence or natural causation. A stumble that led to a fatal fall, an unexpected storm that caught travelers unprepared, an epidemic that swept through overcrowded settlements. All these might mask the deliberate intervention of shadow emissaries. Yet these masters were not mere destroyers, despite surface appearances. Their domains served essential functions in the cosmic order, maintaining the balance between creation and dissolution that allowed new life to emerge from the components of the old. Without their intervention, the world would become choked with endless accumulation, new generations unable to find space for growth, innovation stifled by the weight of unchanging tradition. The testing apparatus of this netherworld reflected this deeper purpose. Spirits who descended to the shadow realm faced not arbitrary torture, but precisely calibrated challenges designed to reveal their true spiritual nature. Those who proved worthy of metamorphosis would emerge from their ordeals elevated to new forms of existence. Those who failed would be recycled back into the great wheel of being, their essence redistributed among new configurations of life. The ordeals themselves took place in a series of houses, each designed to test specific aspects of character and spiritual development. The House of Gloom challenged visitors to maintain inner light, despite being surrounded by absolute darkness. Here, courage mattered less than faith. The ability to believe in illumination, even when no evidence supported such belief. Many who entered this chamber never emerged, not because they were physically destroyed, but because they allowed despair to extinguish the spark of hope that made consciousness possible. The House of Knives presented a different sort of examination, filling its chambers with obsidian blades that moved with deadly precision through the air. Visitors had to navigate this lethal maze without falling prey to fear or anger, emotions that would cause the blades to multiply and accelerate. Only those who maintained perfect equanimity, treating the dancing knives as mere illusions to be observed rather than threats to be fought, could pass safely through this ordeal. Cold beyond human endurance reigned in the House of Ice, where temperatures dropped so low that breath froze before leaving the lungs and thoughts moved like sluggish rivers. This challenge tested not physical endurance, but spiritual warmth, the ability to maintain compassion and love, even under conditions that seemed to drain all feeling from the heart. Those who succeeded discovered that genuine affection generated its own heat, creating zones of comfort that made survival possible. The House of Jaguars contained no ordinary cats, but spiritual predators, whose spotted coats mapped the positions of stars in the night sky. These celestial felines could see directly into visitors' consciousness, detecting any trace of deception or self-delusion. They devoured not flesh, but falsehood, stripping away every pretense and rationalization until only authentic self-knowledge remained. Many who entered this house fled, rather than face such unflinching examination of their true nature. Fire filled the House of Flames with such intensity that stone itself melted and flowed like water. Yet this was not mere physical combustion, but the flame of purification, burning away everything impure or unnecessary, while leaving essential truth untouched. Visitors who surrendered willingly to this process emerged cleansed and strengthened. Those who resisted found themselves consumed entirely, their ashes scattered to fertilize new growth in the surface world. Most feared of all was the House of Bats, ruled by Camazots, the giant bat whose wings could block out the light of heaven itself. This enormous creature, with eyes like red coals and fangs that dripped with venom, represented the terror of final dissolution. Yet those who looked beyond his frightening appearance might glimpse his true nature as guardian of the threshold between forms of existence. His bite, though lethal to earthly flesh, liberated consciousness from the limitations of physical embodiment. These challenges were not inflicted randomly upon hapless victims, but served as the final examination for spirits who had completed their earthly education. The masters of the shadow domain functioned as cosmic teachers, albeit ones whose pedagogy employed methods that surface instructors would find extreme. Their ultimate goal was not destruction, but metamorphosis, the elevation of awareness to levels that could only be achieved through complete surrender of worldly attachments. The architecture of the netherworld reflected this educational purpose. Chambers flowed into one another according to principles of spiritual development rather than physical convenience. A visitor might find that doors led not to expected destinations, but to whatever experience their consciousness most needed for growth. Time moved differently in various sections of the palace, allowing some examinations to last subjective centuries, while others passed in moments. The shadow rulers themselves embodied lessons about the nature of authority and power. Unlike earthly kings who accumulated wealth and comfort for their personal benefit, these netherworld sovereigns had surrendered all attachment to pleasure or ease. Their palace, though magnificent in its way, contained no luxuries, no entertainment beyond the satisfaction of duty fulfilled. They ruled not for personal aggrandizement, but in service to the cosmic order that required endings to make space for births. The ball court of this testing ground occupied a position of special significance within this domain of ordeals and metamorphosis. Here, the Shadow Masters engaged in contests that were simultaneously sport, ritual, and judicial proceeding. The game itself involved keeping a rubber ball in motion using only hips, shoulders, and elbows, a task that required extraordinary skill, endurance, and teamwork. Yet the deeper meaning of these matches extended far beyond athletic competition. The ball represented the sun in its daily journey across the sky. The players took the roles of cosmic forces, maintaining universal order, and the outcome of each game determined the fate of spirits awaiting judgment. When the netherworld rulers played among themselves, they wagered not material goods, but aspects of destiny itself. The timing of epidemics, the severity of droughts, the success or failure of harvests in the surface world. The ball court's construction embodied profound symbolic meaning. Shaped like a capital I, when viewed from above, it represented the narrow passage between life and its conclusion, through which all consciousness must eventually travel. The sloped walls that contained the playing field symbolized the difficulty of maintaining balance during this crucial transition. The stone rings mounted high on these walls, through which players occasionally managed to pass the ball, marked the rare moments when earthly beings achieved perfect harmony with cosmic forces. Sound played a crucial role in the netherworld's functioning. The noise of the ball game, echoing through chambers carved from living rock, carried messages throughout the shadow domain's 13 levels. The rhythm of the bouncing ball synchronized with the heartbeats of all living creatures, while the players' shouts and exertions created vibrations that influenced weather patterns in the surface world. When games grew particularly intense, their sound could be heard even above ground, manifesting as thunder, earthquake, or the rumbling that preceded volcanic eruptions. The masters of this testing ground paid careful attention to these acoustic phenomena, reading in them signs and portents that guided their governance of the netherworld. A ball that bounced with unusual frequency might indicate an approaching period of rapid population growth, requiring increased attention to life's harvest. Echoes that lingered longer than normal could signal the presence of particularly significant spirits, deserving special scrutiny during their examinations. Water featured prominently in the shadow domain's geography, though these were not the life-giving streams that nourished surface vegetation. Rivers of blood flowed through certain chambers, carrying the vital essence that had been voluntarily or involuntarily released by dying creatures. These crimson torrents eventually merged into great underground lakes, where the substance of existence accumulated before being redistributed to nourish new forms of being. Other waterways ran clear as crystal, but carried memories rather than minerals, the accumulated experiences of every spirit that had passed through the netherworld's challenges. To drink from these streams meant to temporarily share the consciousness of countless others who had made the same journey, gaining wisdom at the cost of individual identity. The shadow rulers themselves periodically immersed themselves in these memory pools, ensuring that their judgments remained informed by direct understanding of earthly experience. Steam rose from various points throughout the testing ground, created by the interaction between hot springs and cool air. This vapor carried prophetic visions to those capable of interpreting its shifting patterns. Skilled masters could read in these misty formations detailed information about future events in the surface world, which kings would rise or fall, where natural disasters would strike, what innovations would transform human civilization. The relationship between the netherworld and the surface sphere was neither hostile nor indifferent, but characterized by stern compassion. The shadow rulers understood that life's conclusion served essential functions in the cosmic order, preventing stagnation while encouraging growth and development. They took no pleasure in suffering, but recognized its role in education, knowing that consciousness often required challenging experiences to abandon harmful attachments and achieve spiritual maturity. This complex dynamic would soon face its greatest test. Even as the masters maintained their ancient vigil over the processes of metamorphosis, events in the surface world were building toward a confrontation that would challenge their authority and ultimately reshape the relationship between earthly existence and transcendence. The ball court would echo with contests more significant than any previously played, and the outcome would transform the cosmic order itself. The stage was now set for heroes to emerge, beings capable of challenging finality itself while respecting the deeper truths that life's conclusion served. The testing ground waited, its masters prepared for visitors who would prove worthy of their most demanding challenges. Players skilled enough to compete in games where the stakes extended far beyond individual survival, to encompass the spiritual evolution of all conscious beings. In the earthly sphere, where morning light painted the mountains gold and evening shadows pooled in valley depths, two remarkable brothers had mastered skills that would soon echo through the stone chambers far below. Hun-Hunahpu and Vukub-Hunahpu possessed abilities that set them apart from ordinary inhabitants of the middle domain, not via supernatural powers, but by perfect dedication to the ancient game that connected ground to sky, players to universal forces, rhythm to the very heartbeat of creation itself. These brothers lived in a time when the realm still remembered its recent formation, when the memory of failed clay and wooden people lingered like morning mist, when the Maker's voice could still be heard in wind and water for those who knew how to listen. Their grandmother, Ixmucain, kept the sacred calendar and tended the corn that would one day provide substance for true humanity. Their grandfather had passed into the Western Territories, leaving behind only stories and the profound silence that follows great wisdom. The brothers had inherited more than human blood. In their veins flowed something of the creative force that shaped mountains and carved riverbeds, though neither fully understood their heritage. This inheritance manifested most clearly in their relationship with the ball game, that heavenly sport which served simultaneously as recreation, ritual, and rehearsal for the great contests that determined universal balance. Every dawn found them at their ball court, a carefully constructed arena that occupied the level ground near their dwelling. Unlike the elaborate stone courts that would grace future cities, theirs was built with loving simplicity, earthen walls that rose just high enough to contain the game's energy, playing areas smoothed by countless hours of devoted practice. Yet what it lacked in grandeur, it compensated for in spiritual resonance. The brothers had constructed their court according to proportions revealed in dreams, dimensions that unknowingly mirrored the sacred geometry of far greater arenas. The game itself required extraordinary skill, demanding that players keep a solid rubber ball in constant motion, using only their hips, shoulders, and forearms. No hands could touch the sphere, no feet could guide its path. Only the practiced coordination of body and spirit could maintain the rhythm that gave the contest meaning. The ball, formed from the sap of trees that grew in hidden groves, possessed weight that challenged even the strongest players, and resilience that could withstand the most vigorous competition. Hunhunapu, the elder brother, approached the game with methodical precision. His movements flowed like water finding its course, each gesture calculated for maximum efficiency with minimum effort. He read the ball's trajectory as easily as others read the flight patterns of birds, anticipating its path with an intuition that bordered on prophecy. When he struck the sphere with his hip, the impact resonated with perfect timing, sending vibrations across the court's walls that harmonized with the natural frequencies of earth and sky. Vukub Hunapu brought to their partnership a different energy, explosive power channeled via careful discipline. Where his brother embodied flowing water, he manifested controlled lightning. His strikes sent the ball careening in trajectories that seemed to defy earthly physics, yet each apparently wild shot served a strategic purpose in their elaborate cooperation. Together, the brothers achieved a synthesis that elevated mere sport into something approaching artistic expression. Their daily practice sessions created rhythms that penetrated deep into the foundation. The steady percussion of ball against hip, hip against ball, established patterns that synchronized with celestial cycles. Birds adjusted their morning songs to harmonize with these sounds. Nearby streams altered their flow to match the cadences emanating from the court. Even the wind seemed to pause and listen when the brothers played, as if the very atmosphere recognized the significance of their activity. What the brothers did not realize was that their games generated vibrations that traveled far beyond the terrestrial sphere. Each impact, each rhythmic sequence, each perfectly executed play sent waves of sound spiraling downward across layers of rock and soil, across underground rivers and cavern systems, eventually reaching the 13 levels of the testing ground below. There, in chambers where shadow masters maintained their eternal vigil, these earthly sounds arrived as something between music and challenge. At first, the netherworld rulers paid little attention to the distant echoes. The sounds of terrestrial activity often filtered down to their domain: footsteps of travelers, the rumbling of carts on ancient roads, the ceremonial drumming that accompanied religious festivals. These acoustic intrusions were as natural and ignorable as the sound of rain on stone. But the rhythmic precision of the brothers' ball game possessed qualities that distinguished it from ordinary noise. The tempo matched exactly the ceremonial cadences used in the most sacred rituals of the shadow domain. The harmonic progressions echoed musical patterns that the netherworld dwellers employed in their own celestial games. Most disturbing of all, the skill level demonstrated by these terrestrial players suggested abilities that might rival those of the testing ground's own champions. What had begun as mere background noise gradually became a source of irritation, then concern, finally escalating into something approaching insult. One who rules, finality, supreme sovereign of the shadow domain, was the first to voice what many had begun to think. These upper dwellers presume too much, he declared during a council session in the great chamber where policy decisions were made. They play the sacred game as if they were our equals, creating rhythms that disturb our own competitions. Their presumption challenges the proper hierarchy that places us below and them above. 7. Who commands? Endings nodded gravely, his bone crown catching the phosphorescent light that illuminated their meeting place. The sounds of their play penetrate even our deepest chambers. Our own games suffer interruption when their noise creates conflicting rhythms. This cannot be permitted to continue unchecked. The lesser rulers of the testing ground added their own complaints. Bloodgatherer reported that the terrestrial vibrations interfered with his collection of vital essences from dying creatures. Pus Master claimed that the rhythmic disturbances disrupted the natural progression of diseases that served important functions in maintaining population balance. Wing insisted that the sounds made it difficult to time his sudden strikes with the precision that his role required. As days passed and the brothers continued their dedicated practice, the complaints from below intensified. The shadow domain's own ball games suffered from the acoustic interference. Balls that should have followed predictable paths began to behave erratically. Players who had perfected their timing over centuries found their coordination disrupted by the competing rhythms from above. Most troubling of all, some of the younger netherworld dwellers began to express curiosity about these terrestrial players whose skills seemed to rival their own. The situation demanded resolution. The universal hierarchy that placed the testing ground below and the inhabited sphere above was not merely a matter of geography, but of fundamental structure. Earthly beings were meant to live their brief existences in ignorance of the greater powers that governed their ultimate destinies. Their role was to provide raw material for the shadow domain's transformative processes, not to challenge the supremacy of those who managed such celestial responsibilities. After much deliberation, the Netherworld Council reached a unanimous decision. The terrestrial players would be invited to demonstrate their abilities in the testing ground's own ball court. This would serve multiple purposes. It would bring the irritating noise to an end. It would provide entertainment for the shadow dwellers. And it would re-establish proper hierarchy by demonstrating the vast gulf between amateur earthly players and the true masters of the heavenly game. The invitation itself required careful crafting. Direct summons from the testing ground typically meant immediate termination for terrestrial dwellers, a fate that would deprive the shadow rulers of the sporting contest they desired. Instead, they would employ more subtle methods, making the brothers' journey to the netherworld appear voluntary while ensuring that it would be irrevocable. Packstrap and Bone Staff, the shadow domain's most trusted messengers, received detailed instructions for their mission. They would approach the brothers not as harbingers of doom, but as admirers of their skill, bearing an invitation that would appeal to their pride as athletes, while concealing the true nature of the challenge they faced. The messengers ascended via passages that led from the deepest testing chambers to the terrestrial sphere, traveling routes that existed in the borderlands between physical and ethereal geography. They emerged from a cave that opened onto the hillside above the brothers' dwelling, timing their arrival to coincide with the daily practice session that had so disturbed their masters below. Hun Hunapu and Vushub Hunapu were deep in concentration when the strangers appeared at the edge of their court. The brothers maintained their rhythm even as they observed the newcomers, two figures whose appearance suggested they had traveled far and carried news of unusual importance. The visitors' clothing bore the dust of distant roads. Their bearing suggested official purpose. Yet something about their presence created an unease that neither brother could quite identify. Bonestaff stepped forward as the brothers' game reached a natural pause. "Greetings, renowned players," he called out, his voice carrying the tone of respectful admiration. "We have traveled far to witness skills that have become legendary even in distant lands. Your reputation has spread beyond these valleys to places where the greatest athletes gather to test their abilities." Hun Hunapu wiped sweat from his brow and approached the visitors with the courtesy due to travelers. "You honor us with your words, friends. We play for love of the game itself, not for fame or recognition. But all who appreciate this sacred sport are welcome to observe our practice." Packstrap produced a scroll case crafted from jade and precious metals, its exterior inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the changing light. "We bear more than mere compliments," he announced. "The masters of the greatest ball court ever constructed have heard of your abilities. They extend an invitation to compete in games where the stakes are worthy of your evident skills." The brothers exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. Both felt the pull of the challenge, the allure of testing their abilities against truly worthy opponents. Yet both also sensed something unusual about these messengers, something that suggested their invitation carried implications beyond simple athletic competition. Vukub Hunapu was the first to speak. "Where is this court you mention? What masters have honored us with their attention?" "The location is not easily described in terrestrial terms," Bonestaff replied carefully. "It lies in a direction that requires special knowledge to find. Downward rather than forward, deeper rather than distant. As for the masters who await you, they are beings whose understanding of the ball game extends far beyond mere physical skill. They play for stakes that earthly athletes never imagine." The description should have warned the brothers away, but the competitive fire that burned in their hearts overwhelmed whatever caution they might have felt. Here was the opportunity they had unknowingly prepared for via countless hours of dedicated practice. The chance to test their abilities against opponents worthy of their talents. Hun Hunapu examined the jade scroll case, noting craftsmanship that surpassed anything he had seen in the terrestrial sphere. The very weight of the object suggested its importance, while the shifting symbols hinted at meanings that lay beyond ordinary comprehension. "When would these masters expect us to arrive?" he asked. "Immediately," Packstrap replied. "The invitation is not one that permits delay or preparation. True athletes need no advance notice to demonstrate their skills. They are always ready for any challenge that presents itself." The urgency should have raised further suspicions, but the brothers' excitement at the prospect of legendary competition overwhelmed their natural caution. They gathered their equipment, the balls they had crafted with special care, the protective padding that guarded hips and shoulders during play, the ceremonial ornaments they wore during formal games, and prepared to accompany their mysterious visitors. Xmukane, the brothers' grandmother, emerged from the dwelling as they made ready for departure. Her ancient eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with wisdom, studied the strangers with evident concern. Something about their bearing triggered memories of old stories, tales of visitors who came bearing invitations that led young men into domains from which they never returned. "Where do you travel, my grandsons?" she asked, though her question carried undertones that suggested she already suspected the answer. "To play the ball game, grandmother," Hunhunapu replied, his voice bright with anticipation. "We have been invited to compete against masters whose skills are said to surpass any earthly players. This is the opportunity we have trained for all our existences." The old woman's expression darkened as her fears crystallized into certainty. "Take care that your pride does not lead you into dangers you do not understand," she warned. "Not all invitations lead to honor, and not all games can be won by skill alone." Her words carried weight, born of experience and intuition, but the brothers' excitement had reached levels that made them deaf to warnings. They embraced their grandmother with the casual affection of young men who expected to return before evening brought the cooking fires to activity. The tragic irony of this farewell, that it would be their last moment together in the domain of living warmth, passed unnoticed by all except the ancient woman whose eyes had learned to see beyond the immediate present. Packstrap and Bone Staff led the brothers toward the cave from which they had emerged, following paths that seemed familiar at first, but gradually became strange in ways that defied specific description. The landscape remained recognizable, the same trees, the same stones, the same streams, yet something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between these elements. Colors appeared more vivid, yet somehow less substantial. Sounds carried farther than they should, while simultaneously seeming muffled. The very air felt thinner, as if the brothers were ascending to great heights rather than descending into valleys. As they walked, the messengers maintained conversation, designed to keep their companions focused on the glory awaiting them rather than the oddities of their journey. They spoke of ball courts carved from solid stone, of games that lasted for days without pause, of contests where victory brought rewards beyond earthly imagination. Each description heightened the brothers' anticipation while drawing their attention away from the gradual alteration of their surroundings. The cave mouth, when they reached it, appeared unremarkable from the outside, simply another opening in the hillside, no different from dozens of others that dotted the landscape. Yet as they passed across its threshold, the brothers felt a change that registered more in their essence than their physical senses. The air grew cooler, carrying scents of mineral water and distant smoke. The light, though still adequate for vision, acquired a quality that seemed to come from no identifiable source. Their descent began gradually, following passages that wound deeper into the foundation with each step. At first, the brothers could look back and still see daylight filtering across the entrance behind them. But as they progressed, that connection to the terrestrial sphere grew dimmer and finally disappeared entirely, leaving them dependent on the phosphorescent fungi that clung to the tunnel walls to illuminate their way. The messengers led them across a labyrinth of chambers and corridors, some natural and others clearly carved by intelligent design. Underground streams crossed their path at regular intervals, their dark waters reflecting the strange light in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Occasionally they glimpsed vast spaces opening beyond their illuminated route, caverns so large that their own footsteps produced echoes that suggested cathedral-like proportions. Time became difficult to measure in this environment. The brothers felt as though they had been walking for hours, yet their bodies showed no signs of fatigue. Conversely, certain passages seemed to stretch endlessly, while consuming only moments to traverse. The normal rhythms that govern terrestrial existence, heartbeat, breathing, the subtle cycles of energy and rest, began to synchronize with different patterns, frequencies that resonated with the deep stone around them. Finally, after what might have been hours or days, their guides brought them to a vast chamber whose proportions dwarfed anything the brothers had previously imagined. Here was the ball court of the testing ground, carved from living rock with precision that made human architecture seem crude by comparison. The playing field stretched into distant shadows, its boundaries marked by walls that rose higher than the tallest trees. Stone rings mounted on these walls caught the phosphorescent light, appearing to float in midair like captured stars. But most impressive of all were the figures who waited to greet them, the shadow rulers in all their terrible majesty. One who rules, finality, and seven who commands endings, occupied thrones carved from single blocks of obsidian, their forms radiating authority that made earthly kings seem like children playing at governance. Around them stood the lesser masters of the testing ground, each terrible and magnificent in their own particular way. The brothers felt their confidence waver for the first time since accepting the invitation. These were not merely skilled athletes, but beings whose very presence suggested powers that transcended physical ability. Yet their pride as players prevented them from showing fear, and their genuine love of the game overcame their growing awareness that they had entered a contest whose rules they did not fully understand. One who rules finality rose from his throne and approached them with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in the deepest chambers of their hearts. Welcome, terrestrial players, to the court where the true game is played. Here you will have opportunity to demonstrate whether your skills match your reputation. The challenge was issued, the players had arrived, and the contest that would reshape the universal hierarchy was about to begin. Yet for all their talent and dedication, the brothers remained unaware that they were participating in something far greater than athletic competition, a test that would determine not only their own fate, but the future relationship between the terrestrial sphere and the domain of shadows below. The contest in the underworld's ball court began with ceremonial formality that masked deadly intent. Hun Hunahpu and Vuchub Hunahpu, still believing they faced merely superior athletes, prepared for what they assumed would be a difficult but ultimately fair competition. The Death Lords, however, had designed this encounter as the first in a series of increasingly impossible tests, each calculated to demonstrate the vast gulf between earthly abilities and otherworldly power. The game itself unfolded with a rhythm that seemed almost normal at first. The brothers displayed the skills that had made them legendary in their own sphere, keeping the rubber ball in constant motion with precision that drew grudging admiration even from their hostile hosts. Yet as the contest progressed, subtle alterations in the rules became apparent, alterations that favored the underworld dwellers while placing the mortal players at increasing disadvantage. The ball grew heavier with each exchange, its weight increasing beyond what human strength could reasonably manage. The court's dimensions seemed to shift and expand, forcing the brothers to cover impossible distances to maintain play. Most insidiously, the very air began to thicken, making each breath a struggle, and each movement an exercise in overcoming resistance that had not been present moments before. Despite these mounting difficulties, the brothers fought valiantly to maintain their performance. Their love of the game itself, their pride in abilities earned through countless hours of practice, and their determination not to shame themselves before these otherworldly opponents drove them to superhuman efforts. For a time, sheer will and perfect teamwork allowed them to compensate for the increasingly hostile conditions. But the Death Lords had not invited them to witness an upset victory. As the game reached its climax, the underworld rulers employed their ultimate advantage, the ability to alter reality itself within their territory. The ball became something that was no longer quite physical, simultaneously heavier than stone and lighter than air, solid when the brothers tried to strike it, yet intangible when their opponents made contact. The inevitable conclusion arrived not through any failure of skill or effort, but through the simple impossibility of competing against adversaries who controlled the very nature of the contest itself. The brothers found themselves overwhelmed, their legendary abilities rendered meaningless against opponents who could rewrite the fundamental rules that governed physical reality. Their defeat was swift once the Death Lords chose to end the charade. One final, impossible play sent the ball careening beyond any hope of retrieval, and the game concluded with the earthly champions lying exhausted on the court's stone floor, their strength spent in futile struggle against forces that transcended mortal limitations. What followed was not the honorable treatment that defeated athletes might expect in the upper world, but a series of ordeals designed to break both body and spirit. The underworld rulers, having demonstrated their superiority in the ball game, now proceeded to subject their victims to the full apparatus of examination that served as their primary function in the cosmic hierarchy. The brothers were led through each of the 6 houses that formed the core of the Death Lord's evaluation system. In the House of Gloom, they struggled to maintain hope, while surrounded by darkness so complete that it seemed to devour light itself. The House of Knives demanded they navigate forests of obsidian blades that moved with malevolent intelligence. Freezing temperatures in the House of Ice tested their ability to preserve warmth of spirit when physical comfort became impossible. The House of Jaguars subjected them to the scrutiny of celestial cats whose eyes penetrated every pretense and self-deception. In the House of Fire, they faced flames that burned away everything false while threatening to consume truth along with falsehood. Finally, the House of Bats brought them before Camazotz himself, the great winged guardian whose bite promised liberation from earthly limitations at the cost of earthly life. Through each ordeal, the brothers demonstrated courage and determination that impressed even their tormentors. They faced every trial with dignity, supported each other through the worst moments, and maintained their essential humanity despite pressures designed to strip away everything that made them who they were. Yet for all their admirable qualities, they lacked the special knowledge and supernatural assistance that would be necessary to overcome tests designed by beings whose understanding of reality far exceeded that of any terrestrial creature. The end came in the House of Bats, where Camazotz's enormous wings blocked out what little light penetrated the chamber. The great bat, whose eyes glowed like coals and whose fangs dripped with venom that could dissolve both flesh and spirit, waited patiently for the brothers to exhaust themselves in futile attempts to find escape or safe passage. When death finally claimed the elder brother and his companion, it came not as punishment for any moral failing, but as the inevitable consequence of opposing powers beyond their comprehension. Their bodies, once so perfectly adapted to the ball game they loved, became offerings on the altar of underworld justice. Hunhunapu's head was taken as a trophy, symbol of the Death Lord's supremacy over any earthly presumption. But termination in the underworld was not mere ending. It was metamorphosis. The severed head, instead of simply becoming another gruesome ornament in the Death Palace, was carried to a special place within the vast underground geography. Here, in a garden where impossible things grew under light that came from no visible source, stood a plant unlike any in the mortal sphere. This miraculous tree had never before borne any produce, its branches remaining eternally barren despite the careful tending it received from the underworld's gardeners. Yet when the brother's head was hung among its limbs, a wonder occurred that surprised even the Death Lords who had orchestrated the champion's destruction. The plant immediately burst into abundant bearing, its branches heavy with gourds that seemed to pulse with inner radiance. This change served multiple purposes in the complex machinery of the underworld's operation. It demonstrated that even in death, awareness could find new forms of expression. It provided a tangible symbol of the Death Lord's power to reshape the very nature of being. Most importantly, from the ruler's perspective, it created a monument to their victory over mortal presumption, a living reminder that earthly beings who opposed otherworldly authority would find themselves incorporated into the underworld's own purposes. Yet the miracle contained implications that the Death Lords had not anticipated. The plant's sudden fertility created something unprecedented in their territory, a source of life energy that operated independently of their direct control. The produce that hung heavy on its branches contained not mere plant matter, but awareness itself, concentrated into a form that retained the essential qualities of the brother whose destruction had created it. News of this marvel spread throughout the 13 levels of the underworld, carried by the same acoustic networks that had originally transmitted the brothers' ballgame sounds from the mortal world. Death dwellers who had become accustomed to the unchanging nature of their territory found themselves confronting something genuinely novel, a change that suggested possibilities they had never before considered. Among those who heard these reports was a young woman whose presence in the underworld represented one of its most closely guarded secrets. The maiden belonged to a noble family among the Death Dwellers, daughter of one of the lesser rulers who served the supreme masters in their governance of the examination apparatus. Unlike the ancient beings who had shaped the underworld's fundamental nature, she possessed something approaching what terrestrial creatures would recognize as youth, curiosity, and the capacity for wonder. She had lived her entire span within the Death Lord's territory, knowing no other reality than the chambers and passages that formed her people's vast underground civilization. The stories that filtered down from the mortal sphere seemed to her like fantastic tales from an impossible place where light came from a moving source called sun, and creatures lived brief spans under an open sky. Such concepts lay so far outside her experience that she could barely comprehend their meaning. Yet something about the plant's change captured her imagination in ways that none of the underworld's established marvels had ever managed. Perhaps it was the element of alteration in a territory where stasis reigned supreme, or the suggestion that awareness could transcend the boundaries that seemed to define all being. Whatever the reason, she found herself drawn to visit this miraculous plant. Despite warnings from her family that unauthorized exploration of sensitive areas within the Death Lord's territory carried severe penalties, the journey required navigating passages that few Death Dwellers ever visited, routes that led through the most isolated sections of the underworld's vast complex. Here, far from the populated chambers where the Death civilization conducted its regular activities, the architecture itself seemed different, more organic, less obviously designed, as if these spaces had grown rather than been carved from living rock. The garden where the plant grew occupied a natural cavern whose ceiling disappeared into darkness far above. Phosphorescent vegetation provided enough light to reveal the space's general dimensions, while leaving its furthest reaches mysterious. Streams of clear water flowed through carefully constructed channels, their gentle murmuring creating a constant background music that seemed to respond to the presence of visitors. But dominating everything was the miraculous plant itself, now heavy with produce that seemed to glow with inner radiance. Each gourd hung like a captured star, pulsing with rhythms that echoed the heartbeats she had heard described in tales of mortal life. The sight was so beautiful and so alien to everything she had known that she approached with reverence that bordered on worship. As she drew closer, one particular growth seemed to call out to her, a gourd that hung at exactly the right height for her to reach, positioned as if it had developed specifically to accommodate her visit. The resemblance to a human head was unmistakable, yet the change had rendered it into something that transcended any single category of being. The maiden reached toward the enticing produce, her curiosity overcoming whatever caution she might have felt. At the moment her fingers made contact with its surface, a voice spoke, not audibly, but directly into her awareness, bypassing her ears entirely to resonate in the deepest chambers of her being. "Do you truly desire what this plant offers?" the voice asked, and somehow she knew it came from the growth she touched, from the altered awareness of the elder brother himself. "What hangs here is not mere vegetation, but life itself, concentrated and changed. To taste of it means to accept consequences that will reshape your entire span." The warning should have deterred her, but the maiden had lived too long in a territory where nothing ever changed, where each day brought only repetition of established patterns. The possibility of alteration, even with unknown consequences, appealed to something deep within her nature that had never found expression in the underworld's changeless environment. "I desire it," she replied, though she spoke the words only in her mind. "Whatever consequences await, they cannot be worse than living forever without change, without growth, without the possibility of becoming something more than what I have always been." The growth pulsed with brighter light at her declaration, and the voice spoke again. "Then receive what we offer, but know that you become part of a pattern larger than any individual span. What begins in you will not end with you. You carry forward a destiny that connects the mortal sphere with this death territory, a bridge between places that have been too long separated." At that moment, the maiden felt a change begin within her body, not painful, but so profound that it seemed to reach into the very essence of what she was and alter it at the most fundamental level. She knew with certainty that bypassed rational understanding, that she now carried within herself new life that would reshape not only her own being, but the relationship between all the territories of reality. The miracle of conception without physical union, of life arising from the altered awareness of the defeated brothers, marked a turning point in the cosmic balance that governed all reality. The Death Lords had thought to demonstrate their supremacy by destroying the mortal champions, but their victory had created conditions for something unprecedented. The birth of beings who would combine the best qualities of both worlds while transcending the limitations of either. The maiden's pregnancy progressed with supernatural speed, her body adapting to nurture new forms of life that had never before appeared in any territory. As her condition became apparent, it generated confusion and alarm among the death dwellers who discovered it. Pregnancy was not unknown in their place, but this particular conception bore characteristics that suggested divine intervention or cosmic irregularity. Her father, Blood Gatherer, was among the first to notice the changes in his daughter. His role in the underworld's hierarchy required him to understand the flow of vital essences throughout all territories of reality, making him sensitive to alterations in the patterns that governed life and death. The energy that now emanated from his daughter carried signatures unlike anything in his extensive experience. When confronted with demands for explanation, the maiden found herself in an impossible position. The truth that she had conceived through mystical contact with the altered awareness of deceased mortal champions would be rejected as fantasy by minds that had never conceived of such possibilities. Yet any false explanation would eventually be exposed. leading to consequences that might threaten not only her own span, but the unprecedented lives she carried within her body. Her father's anger, when he finally grasped the implications of her condition, reflected not merely personal disappointment, but cosmic outrage at what appeared to be a violation of the fundamental order that separated different territories of reality. In his view, his daughter had somehow contaminated herself with alien influences that threatened the purity of the underworld's carefully maintained isolation. The demands for resolution came swiftly. Bloodgatherer, acting in his official capacity as one of the Death Lord's enforcement officers, declared that his daughter's condition represented a threat to cosmic stability that could not be permitted to continue. The unauthorized pregnancy must be terminated, and the foreign influences that had created it must be eliminated before they could spread to contaminate other aspects of the underworld's operation. But the maiden had been changed by her contact with the miraculous plant in ways that went beyond mere physical conception. She now possessed knowledge and abilities that had not been present in her awareness before, understanding that connected her to cosmic patterns that transcended any single territory of reality. When threatened with destruction, she found within herself resources for resistance that surprised both her persecutors and herself. The confrontation that followed would determine whether the new forms of life developing within her body would have opportunity to fulfill their cosmic purpose, or whether the underworld's commitment to unchanging order would prevent the emergence of beings who might bridge the gap between mortal and otherworldly spheres. The outcome would reshape not only the Death Lord's internal balance, but the fundamental relationship between all the layered territories that comprised reality itself. The young woman's desperate flight from her father's wrath led her through passages she had never before explored, carrying within her body the seeds of a destiny that would reshape the universal order itself. Bloodgatherer's rage at his daughter's mysterious condition had escalated beyond personal fury into an official decree of execution, forcing her to choose between certain termination and the uncertain refuge that might await in the upper territories of creation. Her escape route wound upward through chambers that grew progressively lighter as she climbed, following underground rivers that flowed towards sources of illumination she had heard described but never witnessed. The journey tested her transformed body to its limits, yet something within the developing lives she carried seemed to guide her steps, providing strength when her own resources failed, and direction when the pathways branched into confusion. When she finally emerged into the surface world, the experience overwhelmed senses that had known only the controlled environment of the realm below. The open sky stretched impossibly far overhead, its blue vastness seeming to threaten engulfment rather than offer liberation. The sun's direct rays burned her eyes, accustomed as they were to the gentle phosphorescence of underground fungi. Even the wind, carrying scents of growing things and distant rain, struck her as almost violently alive compared to the still air of the death caverns. Yet for all its strangeness, this upper territory offered her what the depths could not: the possibility of bringing her unprecedented condition to completion without interference from those who viewed it as a universal abomination. Here, among beings who understood the cycles of birth and growth that governed mortal life, she might find acceptance for the miracle developing within her body. Her arrival at the dwelling of the ancient grandmother, keeper of corn and guardian of calendrical wisdom, created a situation fraught with both promise and peril. The old woman recognized immediately that her unexpected visitor carried something far more significant than ordinary childbearing. The energy that emanated from the young woman's body bore unmistakable traces of her lost grandsons, suggesting impossibilities that challenged even her vast understanding of universal patterns. The initial reception was hostile, as might be expected when a daughter of the shadow rulers appeared at the threshold of those who had suffered their cruelest judgment. The elder's grief at losing Hunhunapu and Vushub-Hunapu had settled into the bitter acceptance that comes with age and wisdom. But the sight of this otherworldly visitor reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. "What daughter of destroyers dares approach this dwelling?" the old woman demanded, her voice carrying the authority of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of universal ages. "Have the Shadow Masters sent another messenger to torment those who have already given more than any should be asked to sacrifice?" The young woman's response revealed both her desperation and her growing understanding of the forces that had shaped her fate. "I come not as their agent, but as their victim," she replied, her words carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from depths beyond her apparent years. "I carry within me the continuation of what they sought to destroy, the legacy of your grandsons, transformed but not eliminated by their encounter with otherworldly power." The claims seemed impossible, yet the grandmother's sensitivity to the subtle energies that governed life and termination detected truths that rational analysis might reject. The rhythms emanating from the visitor's body matched exactly the patterns she had learned to associate with her grandsons during their earthly lives. More remarkably still, these patterns seemed to be evolving, developing characteristics that suggested capabilities far beyond what the original heroes had possessed. The test that followed would determine whether the young woman's extraordinary claims could withstand scrutiny from one whose wisdom encompassed centuries of experience with universal mysteries. The elder led her visitor to the garden, where she maintained the sacred corn that would one day provide the substance for true humanity's creation. Here, among plants that responded to the deeper rhythms of reality's development, any deception would be quickly revealed. "If you truly carry the essence of my grandsons," the old woman declared, "then demonstrate your connection to the forces that governed their lives. Show me that what grows within you deserves the protection and nurture that such a miracle would require." The young woman approached the corn plants with reverence, born of her new understanding of the cycles that connected termination to rebirth, ending to beginning. As her hands moved among the growing stalks, the plants responded with vitality that surprised even the grandmother's experienced eyes. Ears that had been slow to develop suddenly swelled with kernels. Leaves that had shown signs of blight became vibrant with health, and the entire garden seemed to pulse with renewed energy. More convincing still was the visitor's intuitive knowledge of growing patterns and seasonal cycles that no underworld dweller should have possessed. She spoke of planting times and harvest rhythms, of the relationship between celestial movements and agricultural success, of the sacred mathematics that governed the transformation of seed into sustenance. Each demonstration strengthened the elder's growing conviction that this unexpected guest truly carried within her body the reborn essence of her lost grandsons. The condition progressed with supernatural speed, as if the developing lives within the young woman's body were eager to complete their gestation and begin their mission. Throughout the remaining days of her term, both women prepared for a birth that would be unlike any that had occurred since the makers first attempted to fashion conscious beings capable of gratitude and remembrance. The labor, when it finally began, unfolded with portents that confirmed the extraordinary nature of what was being born. Thunder rolled across clear skies. Rivers briefly flowed backward, and animals throughout the region gathered as if summoned by signals only they could detect. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation, as though creation itself was holding its breath to witness this unprecedented emergence. The brothers who emerged from this miraculous birth bore names that echoed their predecessors while signaling their enhanced nature. Unlike ordinary infants, They displayed from their first moments an awareness and capability that suggested minds already formed and purposes clearly defined. Their eyes held depths that seemed to reflect knowledge gathered from multiple lifetimes, and their movements possessed a coordination that spoke of bodies perfectly adapted to their mission. The Solar Brother, whose name linked him to the forces that govern day and illumination, bore physical characteristics that seemed to capture and reflect light itself. His skin held a golden quality that made him appear to glow even in subdued lighting, and his eyes carried flecks of color that shifted like flames. When he moved, shadows followed his gestures as if seeking to learn the patterns of motion that would allow them to dance in harmony with light. His companion manifested the complementary principles associated with lunar forces and the mysteries of night. His appearance suggested depths rather than surfaces, spaces between things rather than the things themselves. Where his brother seemed to emit energy, the lunar figure appeared to absorb and transform it, creating around himself zones of contemplative quiet that balanced his siblings' more active emanations. Yet despite their different natures, the pair functioned as aspects of a single consciousness, their thoughts and actions coordinated with precision that surpassed anything achieved by their predecessors. They spoke in harmonies that created meaning beyond the sum of their individual words, moved in patterns that seemed choreographed by universal forces, and demonstrated from their earliest days capabilities that would have challenged experienced adults. Their childhood, though brief by ordinary standards, provided essential preparation for the confrontation that awaited them in the realm below. Under the grandmother's guidance, they mastered not only the ball game that had made their father and uncle famous, but also the deeper mysteries that governed the relationship between physical skill and spiritual power. They learned to read the subtle signs that revealed the true nature of apparently ordinary situations, to detect deception through careful observation of inconsistencies, and to employ wit and wisdom rather than strength alone to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The brothers' approach to the ball game revealed immediately that they possessed understanding far beyond what their predecessors had achieved. Where Hunhunapu and Vukub Hunapu had relied primarily on athletic ability and competitive spirit, the new heroes treated the game as a form of meditation in motion, a spiritual practice that connected them to the forces that governed universal balance. Their play generated rhythms that harmonized with, rather than competed against, the natural frequencies of earth and sky. Birds that had fled during their father's loud games now gathered to observe these gentler but more profound contests. The very stones of their court seemed to resonate with appreciation for this elevated approach to the sacred sport. Most remarkably, the brothers demonstrated the ability to modulate the acoustic effects of their play, controlling exactly what sounds reached the caverns below. This represented a crucial advancement over their predecessors' unconscious disturbance of the Shadow Master's activities. The new heroes could choose when to announce their presence and when to practice in silence, a capability that would prove essential in the strategies they were already beginning to develop. As their skills matured, so did their understanding of the purpose that had shaped their unprecedented birth. They knew, through knowledge that seemed to flow directly from the transformed essence of their father, that the Shadow Ruler's authority over mortal destiny represented an imbalance in the universal order that required correction. The realm below's current dominance prevented the emergence of true humanity, blocking the Maker's ultimate goal of creating beings capable of proper gratitude and remembrance. The brothers also understood that direct confrontation with the Shadow Masters would likely reproduce the failure that had claimed their predecessors. Superior athletic ability alone would not suffice against opponents who could alter the fundamental rules of physical reality. Instead, victory would require the application of wisdom, cunning, and spiritual insight, qualities that could turn the Death Power's own strength against them. Their preparation involved not only physical training, but also the development of magical abilities that would allow them to meet otherworldly power, with capabilities that transcended ordinary mortal limitations. They learned to transform their physical forms, taking on the shapes of animals when stealth or different perspectives were required. They mastered the art of resurrection, practicing the restoration of life to creatures they had deliberately killed, until the process became as natural as breathing. Perhaps most importantly, they developed the ability to perish and return to life themselves, experiencing the transition between states of being until they understood the mechanisms that governed such transformations. This knowledge would prove crucial when they faced opponents whose primary weapon was the apparent finality of termination itself. As their capabilities reached maturity, the pair began to generate the acoustic signals that would announce their readiness for the ultimate confrontation. Their ball game sessions produced sounds that penetrated the caverns below with perfect clarity, creating rhythms that explicitly challenged the shadow rulers to demonstrate their supposed superiority. The response from below came with predictable swiftness. The same messengers who had lured Hunhunapu and Vuchubhunapu to their doom emerged from underground passages, bearing invitations phrased in terms designed to appeal to athletic pride while concealing deadly intent. But unlike their predecessors, the Solar and Lunar brothers understood exactly what they faced and had prepared accordingly. They accepted the invitation with full knowledge of its implications, confident that their enhanced abilities and deeper wisdom would allow them to succeed where pure athletic skill had failed. The journey to the realm below unfolded differently for these prepared heroes. Where their father and uncle had been gradually deceived and led astray, the pair maintained clear awareness of their situation throughout the descent. They observed carefully the routes taken and the landmarks passed, creating mental maps that would serve them well in the trials ahead. More significantly, they employed their shape-shifting abilities to send ahead scouts in animal form, gathering intelligence about the Shadow Ruler's current activities and the specific challenges that awaited. A hair plucked from the Solar Brother's head became a mosquito that could penetrate the smallest spaces and observe without detection. The lunar figure's toenail transformed into a gnat capable of following scent trails and eavesdropping on conversations. Through these advanced scouts, the brothers learned the true names of all the Shadow Masters, knowledge that would prove crucial in the psychological warfare that formed a key component of their strategy. They also discovered the current layout of the testing chambers, identifying changes that had been made since their father's time, and noting new traps that had been prepared specifically for their expected arrival. When they finally reached the great ball court of the realm below, they found the Shadow Rulers arranged in full ceremonial regalia, clearly expecting to repeat their previous triumph with minimal effort. The Supreme Masters sat upon their obsidian thrones, radiating confidence born of centuries of unchallenged dominance. Around them, the lesser powers of termination, prepared for what they anticipated would be entertaining sport, followed by the satisfying conclusion of another challenge to their authority. But the heroes who stood before them bore little resemblance to the naive athletes who had provided such easy victory in the previous generation. These figures carried themselves with quiet confidence that suggested capabilities extending far beyond physical prowess. Their eyes held depths that seemed to reflect knowledge of mysteries the Shadow Rulers themselves had never fully fathomed. When one who commands finality rose to deliver his customary welcome, he found himself facing opponents whose very presence seemed to shift the fundamental dynamics of the encounter. The words that had easily intimidated their predecessors fell flat, absorbed by the brothers' calm attention, without producing the desired effects of confusion and fear. "Welcome, surface players," the supreme ruler intoned, his voice carrying harmonics designed to inspire dread. "You have come to face opponents whose mastery of the sacred game extends beyond your comprehension. Prepare to discover the vast difference between earthly pretension and otherworldly reality." The Solar Brothers' response carried undertones of amusement that suggested confidence rather than bravado. "We thank you for this opportunity to test our skills against such renowned opponents. We have heard much of your abilities and look forward to learning what centuries of practice in this magnificent court have taught you about the true nature of the game." The courtesy was perfect, yet something in its phrasing suggested that the heroes viewed the upcoming contest as educational rather than intimidating. This unexpected attitude created the first crack in the Shadow Master's psychological dominance, introducing an element of uncertainty into a situation they had expected to control completely. The Lunar Brother added his own contribution to this subtle undermining of their host's confidence. "We hope our presence here will provide entertainment worthy of such distinguished judges of athletic skill. Perhaps through our contest, we may all discover new aspects of a game that clearly holds depths none of us have yet fully explored." The suggestion that the shadow rulers themselves might learn something from the encounter struck at the foundation of their authority, which rested on the assumption of absolute superiority in all matters related to their domain. The pair had managed, with perfect politeness, to introduce the possibility that the upcoming contest might not follow the script that their hosts had prepared. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of these particular heroes, but the future relationship between mortal aspiration and otherworldly power. The Shadow Masters, despite their growing unease, remained confident that their accumulated advantages would ultimately prove decisive. The brothers, drawing upon wisdom gained through their miraculous birth and supernatural preparation, prepared to demonstrate that even the most entrenched authority could be challenged by those who combined courage with intelligence and spiritual insight with practical skill. The confrontation between the divine champions and the Death Lords unfolded across days that seemed to stretch beyond normal temporal boundaries. In the great ball court carved from living stone, contests of skill and wit revealed the profound transformation that had occurred in the relationship between earthly aspiration and otherworldly authority. Where their predecessors had faced impossible odds through athletic prowess alone, these new heroes wielded wisdom, cunning, and supernatural abilities that turned every trap into opportunity for demonstration of their enhanced nature. The pair's victories in the examination chambers astonished even the ancient rulers who had designed those trials to be insurmountable. In the House of Gloom, they brought their own illumination that no darkness could extinguish. Through the House of Knives, they moved like dancers, each blade's trajectory anticipated and avoided with grace that transformed deadly menace into choreographed beauty. The House of Ice could not freeze hearts that burned with purpose beyond individual survival, while the House of Jaguars found nothing false to devour in spirits that had been purified through their miraculous birth and careful preparation. Fire could not consume what was already refined to its essential nature, and even Camazotz in his House of Bats discovered that these champions possessed knowledge of Termination's true nature that rendered his fearsome abilities ineffective. When the great bat attempted his signature decapitation, one hero's head was indeed severed, only to be immediately restored through resurrection techniques the duo had mastered during their terrestrial preparation. The final contest in the ball court itself became a demonstration of how wisdom could triumph over raw force. The underworld rulers employed every advantage their realm afforded, altering the ball's weight and substance, shifting the court's dimensions, manipulating the very laws of physics that governed motion and impact. Yet the champions adapted to each change with fluid intelligence, treating these obstacles as variations in a universal dance rather than barriers to overcome through strength. Most devastating to the Death Lord's authority was the heroes' employment of their knowledge of the rulers' true names. This information, gathered through their insect spies, allowed them to address each netherworld figure directly, rather than through the formal titles that maintained psychological distance. When one who commands finality found himself called by his secret appellations that revealed his essential nature and limitations, his air of mysterious invincibility dissipated like morning mist before sunrise. The psychological warfare extended beyond mere naming to encompass sophisticated manipulation of the Death Ruler's expectations and assumptions. The pair allowed themselves to be killed in spectacular fashion, their bodies ground to powder and scattered in the underground rivers that flowed through the realm's deepest chambers. This apparent total defeat led their opponents to celebrate prematurely, relaxing their vigilance at precisely the moment when vigilance was most required. The champion's resurrection occurred not through dramatic reversal, but through patient reconstitution from the scattered elements of their being, like seeds that sprout after lying dormant through winter's harshest months. Their essential nature gathered itself from dissolution and reformed into bodies that retained all their previous capabilities, while gaining new understanding of the relationship between life and apparent termination. When they reappeared in the underworld, it was not as desperate fugitives, but as master performers offering entertainment to the death figures. They presented themselves as traveling dancers and magicians, their true identities concealed through shape-shifting abilities that rendered them unrecognizable even to those who had recently destroyed them. Their performance began with simple tricks that gradually escalated into demonstrations of ability that surpassed anything the Netherworld rulers had previously witnessed. They made buildings disappear and reappear, transformed rocks into birds that sang impossible songs, caused flowers to bloom in chambers where no living thing had ever grown. Most impressive of all, they demonstrated the ability to kill and resurrect each other repeatedly, treating termination and restoration as routine elements in their artistic repertoire. Each ending was more elaborate than the last, each revival more miraculous, until the Death Lords found themselves completely captivated by displays that made their own abilities seem crude by comparison. The trap that sealed their opponent's fate emerged from the Netherworld ruler's own desire to participate in these marvelous transformations. Overwhelmed by curiosity and competitive pride, one who commands finality and seven who brings ending demanded that the disguised heroes perform their ultimate miracle upon the Death Lords themselves. They wished to experience personally the transcendent nature of termination and resurrection that had been demonstrated with such artistry. The champions' response carried undertones of reluctance that only heightened their opponent's desire. Surely, beings of your obvious wisdom and authority require no demonstration of techniques that are mere entertainment compared to your own profound mastery of reality's deepest mysteries, one hero suggested, his apparent deference concealing careful psychological manipulation. Such reverse psychology proved irresistible to entities whose dominance had never before been questioned. The underworld rulers insisted upon immediate demonstration, their commands carrying the weight of absolute authority that they had wielded for countless ages. They would accept no substitutes, no delays, no alternative displays. They demanded to experience personally the transformation that had so impressed them when performed upon others. The duo's compliance with this demand marked the turning point in the universal balance that had governed reality since the earliest days. They performed their miraculous technique upon the supreme death figures, with the same artistry they had displayed in all their previous demonstrations. The Netherworld lords experienced their own termination, with wonder rather than fear, confident that restoration would follow as inevitably as dawn follows darkness. But no resurrection came. The champions stood silently over the bodies of their former tormentors, making no move to reverse the transformation they had performed. When the lesser death authorities demanded restoration of their leaders, they received responses that revealed the true nature of the hero's strategy. "You have asked us to demonstrate our abilities," one explained with perfect reasonableness. "We have done exactly as requested, showing you the ultimate expression of our art. Why do you now ask for something different from what you specifically demanded to witness?" The terrible logic of this position trapped the remaining underworld figures in a paradox of their own making. They had demanded demonstration of the champion's ability, specifically requesting that it be performed upon themselves. Having received exactly what they asked for, they could hardly complain that the demonstration was too effective, or that it should be modified to suit their changing preferences. More fundamentally, the Supreme Death Authority's elimination revealed the extent to which their dominance had depended upon mystique rather than genuine invincibility. Once their limitations were exposed and exploited, their subordinates discovered that they lacked both the ability and the will to maintain the harsh regime that had characterized the Netherworld for ages beyond memory. The transformation of the underworld proceeded rapidly once their absolute authority was broken. The remaining death figures, lacking both their former leader's wisdom and their intimidating presence, found themselves unable to maintain the oppressive system that had previously governed their realm. Lesser spirits, who had long resented their subordinate status, began to assert greater independence, while the examination apparatus that had served as the realm's primary function fell into disrepair through neglect and lack of coordinated oversight. Most significantly, the balance between the terrestrial sphere and the netherworld shifted dramatically in favor of surface dwellers. Where previously the death authorities had commanded absolute control over mortal destiny, they now found their influence constrained to the natural processes of aging and disease. The arbitrary executions and capricious terminations that had characterized their previous rule became impossible to maintain without the fear and respect that their former leaders had commanded. The champion's victory resonated throughout all levels of reality, sending vibrations that reached even the celestial sphere, where the makers maintained their patient vigil over the universe's development. The sounds that had once carried the competitive noise of ball games now transmitted harmonies of triumph and transformation, announcing that a crucial barrier to their ultimate goal had finally been overcome. Tepo, first among the makers, felt the change like music that had suddenly resolved from discord into perfect harmony. "The Netherworld's grip upon mortal destiny has been broken," he announced to his fellow architects. "The path now lies open for our final attempt to fashion beings capable of the gratitude and remembrance we have so long sought to establish." Guchamat stirred with renewed energy, his serpentine form coiling through patterns that expressed anticipation and hope. "Our previous failures taught us that mere physical substance could not provide the foundation for true consciousness. Clay dissolves, wood lacks spirit, but perhaps we have been too limited in our selection of materials." Huracan's voice rumbled with the excitement of approaching resolution. "The divine champions have demonstrated that awareness can transcend apparent termination, that wisdom can triumph over raw force, that careful preparation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. These lessons suggest new approaches to the challenge that has so long frustrated our efforts. The three architects began to contemplate materials and methods that their previous attempts had not considered. Their early failures with clay and wood had taught them that durability and flexibility alone were insufficient to sustain the kind of consciousness they sought to establish. The wooden people's soullessness had demonstrated that intelligence without spiritual depth led inevitably to arrogance and cruelty. Yet the triumph of the divine duo suggested that the key to success lay not in the physical substances used for fashioning, but in the spiritual qualities that could be incorporated into those substances. The hero's victory had been achieved through wisdom, courage, compassion, and respect for universal order, precisely the characteristics that the makers wished to establish in their ultimate creative achievement. Their attention turned to the sacred grain that had been developing in the ancient grandmother's garden throughout the long ages of trial and error. This plant had been nurtured not merely as physical sustenance, but as the repository of lessons learned through countless cycles of growth, harvest, and renewal. Each kernel contained within itself the accumulated wisdom of seasons, the patience required for proper development, the balance between individual growth and community support. Most importantly, this grain represented the willing sacrifice that sustained life through apparent ending. Each harvest required the sacrifice of mature plants so that their seeds could nourish new growth. This cycle embodied the fundamental universal truth that had been demonstrated by the hero's victory, that apparent endings could become beginnings, that destruction could enable renewal, that wisdom emerged through the integration of opposing forces rather than the domination of one over another. The makers approached this new attempt with reverence born of hard-won understanding. They would not simply gather grain and shape it into human forms, as they had previously done with clay and wood. Instead, they would incorporate into the very process of fashioning the spiritual qualities that had enabled the champion's triumph over forces that had seemed insurmountable. The grain they selected came from 4 directions, each variety carrying the sacred associations of its cardinal orientation. White kernels from the north brought the clarity of ancestral wisdom. Red grain from the east contributed the energy of new beginnings. Black seeds from the west added the depth that comes from understanding endings. And yellow kernels from the south provided the abundance that results from patient cultivation. But the makers did not work with raw material. The grain was first ground with the same care and reverence that characterized the most sacred ceremonies. Each grinding stone had been blessed with prayers and offerings. Each motion followed rhythms that harmonized with celestial cycles. The meal that resulted carried within its substance not merely nutritional value, but spiritual essence that had been concentrated through ritual attention and universal alignment. To this foundation, they added clear water, drawn from sources that had never been contaminated by anger, fear, or despair. This water had flowed underground through chambers that resonated with the songs of the earth itself, emerging in springs that had been protected by the divine champions during their terrestrial childhood. It carried within its molecular structure the memory of purity, the potential for cleansing and renewal. The mixture that resulted from combining this sacred meal with blessed water possessed qualities that transcended ordinary physical substance. It could be shaped like clay, yet possessed internal structure that prevented dissolution. It held the flexibility of wood, yet contained spiritual depths that would prevent the soullessness that had doomed the previous attempt. From this miraculous substance, the makers carefully shaped 4 figures that would become the foundation of true humanity. These were not crude experiments, but masterworks of creative art, each detail planned with precision that reflected lessons learned through ages of trial and error. The proportions followed universal mathematics that would allow their consciousness to resonate with celestial harmonies. The features reflected divine ideals of beauty that would inspire rather than intimidate those who looked upon them. Most importantly, the process involved the direct participation of the maker's own consciousness. They did not merely shape passive matter, but breathed into these forms aspects of their own divine awareness. Each figure received specific gifts that would enable it to fulfill particular roles in the universal order, while contributing to the collective wisdom that would characterize humanity as a whole. The first man received the name Jaguar Quetzal, marking his connection to the fierce wisdom that had enabled the divine duo's victory. His consciousness would embody the courage required to face universal challenges while maintaining reverence for the celestial forces that governed reality. He would become the spiritual leader who could guide others through the complexities of life, without falling into the arrogance that had doomed the wooden people. Jaguar Knight, the second figure, embodied the complementary wisdom associated with nocturnal forces and the mysteries that unfold in darkness. His awareness would encompass the patient observation required to understand subtle patterns, the diplomatic skills needed to resolve conflicts without violence, and the intuitive knowledge that could perceive truth even when it was deliberately concealed. The third man, called Not Right Now, represented the virtue of careful timing that had proven crucial in the hero's triumph over the netherworld authorities. His consciousness would understand the importance of patience, the wisdom of waiting for proper moments, rather than forcing premature action, and the universal mathematics that governed the rhythms of celestial development. Dark Jaguar, the fourth figure, incorporated the understanding of depths and mysteries that made complete wisdom possible. His awareness would encompass the necessary darkness that balanced light, the acknowledgement of limitation that prevented hubris, and the acceptance of mystery that made genuine humility achievable. When the makers breathed life into these carefully prepared forms, the result exceeded even their highest expectations. The four men opened their eyes to gaze upon reality, with understanding that immediately grasped the beauty and complexity of what they witnessed. Their first words expressed the gratitude and reverence that the makers had so long sought to hear from conscious beings. "We give thanks to those who have shaped us," Jaguar Quetzal declared, his voice carrying harmonies that resonated with universal frequencies. "We acknowledge the wisdom that has guided our fashioning and the love that has sustained us through the process of becoming." But even as the makers rejoiced in this success, they recognized that their achievement contained within it the seeds of potential problems that would require careful management. The four men's consciousness was so perfectly attuned to celestial patterns that their understanding approached divine levels. They could see to the horizons of reality, comprehend the movements of heavenly bodies, perceive the intricate relationships that connected all aspects of the universe. This near-divine awareness, while impressive, threatened to eliminate the very qualities that made them suitable companions for the makers. If they understood everything, they would have no need for growth, development, or the gradual accumulation of wisdom through experience. If they could perceive all universal patterns directly, they would lose the humility that came from acknowledging the limitations of mortal perspective. The makers faced a delicate challenge that required the utmost care in its resolution. They needed to preserve the essential spiritual qualities that made these beings capable of proper gratitude, while limiting their awareness sufficiently to maintain the dynamic tension between knowledge and mystery that would enable continued growth and development. The solution they devised involved a gentle clouding of the men's vision, not to blind them to truth, but to ensure that truth would be revealed gradually through patient observation and careful study rather than through immediate divine perception. This limitation would preserve the joy of discovery, the satisfaction of earned understanding, and the humility that comes from recognizing the vastness of what remains unknown. The adjustment was made with surgical precision, reducing the men's universal awareness to levels that would allow for growth and development while preserving their essential spiritual nature. They retained their capacity for gratitude, their understanding of their place in the celestial order, and their ability to communicate with the divine through prayer and ceremony. But they lost the immediate access to universal knowledge that would have made learning and development unnecessary. With this crucial modification completed, the makers turned their attention to establishing suitable companions for their male figures. The universal balance required both masculine and feminine principles to be represented in humanity's foundation. During the men's divine sleep, their ribs were carefully removed and shaped into 4 women whose consciousness would complement and complete the spiritual wholeness that true humanity required. The women who emerged from the sleep of the 4 founding fathers possessed consciousness that perfectly complemented their companions, while adding essential qualities that made complete humanity possible. Where the men embodied aspects of leadership, strength, understanding, and timing, their partners brought nurturing insight, intuitive comprehension, communal harmony, and the knowledge of cycles that governed birth, growth, and renewal. Together, these 8 primordial beings established the foundation for all human civilization that would follow. Their children inherited not merely physical characteristics, but spiritual capacities that connected them directly to the architects who had shaped their ancestors from blessed grain and pure water. Each generation carried within its blood the memory of miraculous origin, the understanding of proper relationship with celestial forces, and the responsibility to maintain gratitude for the gift of conscious life. As their descendants multiplied across the fertile landscapes of the Middle Realm, they developed increasingly sophisticated forms of social organization that reflected the universal principles embedded in their very nature. Villages grew into towns, towns expanded into cities, and cities eventually evolved into the great kingdoms that would preserve and transmit the ancient stories of their origin through countless generations of careful remembrance. The Highland people, inheritors of this legacy, established themselves as the primary guardians of the ancestral knowledge that connected humanity's present circumstances to the mythic events that had shaped all reality. Their rulers claimed direct descent from the 4 original fathers, and their authority rested not merely on military prowess or political skill, but on their role as living links to the universal balance that the champions had established through their victory over the forces of arbitrary termination. These royal lineages maintained elaborate genealogies that traced their bloodlines back through hundreds of generations, to Jaguar Quetzal, Jaguar Knight, Not Right Now, and Dark Jaguar. Each king who ascended to power underwent ceremonies that symbolically reenacted the original act of breath that had animated the first humans. The coronation rituals involved offerings of ground maize mixed with precious water, explicit acknowledgement of the debt owed to the makers, and solemn vows to preserve the ancient accounts that explained humanity's purpose and destiny. The preservation of these stories required institutional structures that could maintain accuracy across centuries of transmission. Scribal schools trained young nobles in the complex art of hieroglyphic writing, ensuring that the most important elements of the foundational accounts would be recorded in permanent form on stone monuments, carved wooden panels, and bark paper codices. These written records served not merely as historical documentation, but as holy texts whose very existence helped maintain the universal balance that the victorious champions had established. Yet the Highland people understood that written records alone could not preserve the full richness of their ancestral knowledge. the most profound truths could only be transmitted through oral recitation, passed from generation to generation, through carefully structured performances that preserved not merely the words, but the rhythms, intonations, and spiritual resonances that gave those words their transformative power. The keepers of oral law held positions of extraordinary respect within Highland society. These were not mere entertainers or casual storytellers, but spiritual specialists whose training required decades of intensive study. They memorized not only the complete accounts, but also the complex relationships between different versions, the seasonal appropriateness of various episodes, and the ritual context that gave each telling its proper significance. During the great festivals that marked important transitions in the agricultural and observance calendar, these guardians would recite the foundational stories with participatory involvement from the entire community. The audience did not simply listen passively, but joined in choruses, responded to ritual questions, and participated in dramatic reenactments that brought the ancient events to vivid life in contemporary experience. The ball game itself became a central element in these festival observations. Courts constructed in every major Highland city served not merely as venues for athletic competition, but as holy spaces where the struggles between order and chaos, light and darkness, life and death, could be symbolically renewed through ritual performance. The greatest players were revered as spiritual athletes, whose skills connected them to the victorious champions themselves. These ritual games followed elaborate protocols that transformed sport into religious observance. The rubber balls were blessed with offerings and prayers before each match. The players underwent purification rituals that prepared them to serve as representatives of universal forces. The outcomes were interpreted as communications about the balance between opposing principles that governed all aspects of reality. Most significantly, the courts themselves were designed according to universal principles that made them functional models of reality's fundamental structure. The playing field represented the middle realm where human life unfolded, while the sloped walls symbolized the passages between different levels of existence. The stone rings through which players occasionally managed to pass the ball marked the rare moments when mortal effort achieved perfect harmony with celestial intention. The Spanish conquest of the Maya territories in the 16th century posed an existential crisis for the preservation of these ancient practices. The conquistadors and missionaries who accompanied them viewed indigenous religious observances as demonic delusions that required immediate and complete eradication. Temples were destroyed, codices were burned, and the public performance of ancestral ceremonies was forbidden under penalty of severe punishment. Yet the spiritual understanding that had sustained the Highland people through centuries of awareness could not be eliminated through external coercion alone. In hidden locations throughout the mountain territories, small groups of guardians continued to meet in secret, maintaining their obligations despite the mortal dangers such activities now entailed. They adapted their practices to avoid detection, while preserving the essential elements that connected contemporary communities to their origins. The most remarkable achievement of this clandestine preservation effort was the composition of a written version that employed the Latin alphabet introduced by Spanish missionaries, while maintaining the structure and spiritual content of the original oral accounts. This extraordinary document represented a brilliant synthesis of indigenous understanding and European technology, using the colonizers' own writing system to preserve exactly what they sought to destroy. The anonymous Highland scribes who undertook this dangerous project possessed not only perfect mastery of their ancestral accounts, but also sufficient education in Spanish colonial culture to understand how their work might be preserved and transmitted despite official hostility. They carefully structured their text to emphasize elements that might appeal to Christian readers, while embedding deeper layers of meaning that would remain accessible to those who possessed the ancestral knowledge necessary for proper interpretation. This written record served multiple functions within the resistance culture that developed during the colonial period. For Spanish authorities who might encounter it, the text could be presented as an indigenous attempt to understand Christian theology through the lens of local mythology. For Highland communities, it provided a permanent account of their most precious stories that could survive even if all oral guardians were eliminated through persecution or disease. The manuscript's survival through nearly 2 centuries of colonial suppression testified to the extraordinary dedication of those who protected it. Passed secretly from one generation of guardians to the next, hidden in locations that shifted as circumstances required, the document preserved not merely words on paper, but the living connection between contemporary Highland identity and the events that had established humanity's relationship with celestial forces. The rediscovery of this precious text by Father Francisco Jimenez in the early 18th century marked a crucial turning point in its preservation and eventual transmission to the wider world. The Dominican priest, serving in the Highland town of Chichicastenango, gained the trust of local leaders through his respectful approach to indigenous culture and his genuine interest in understanding rather than simply condemning ancestral beliefs. When community elders finally revealed the existence of their ancient book, Ximenez recognized immediately that he had encountered something of extraordinary significance. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who viewed indigenous texts as curiosities at best or dangerous heresies at worst, he understood that this document represented a sophisticated theological and philosophical system that deserved careful study and preservation. The priest's decision to create both a transcription of the original Highland text and a Spanish translation ensured that this masterpiece of world literature would survive the continuing pressures that threatened all manifestations of indigenous culture. His work required not merely linguistic skill, but cultural sensitivity, as he sought to render into Spanish concepts and accounts that had no direct equivalence in European thought. Ximenez's translation, while inevitably influenced by his own cultural background and religious training, succeeded in conveying the essential beauty and understanding of the original recitation. His Spanish version made the text accessible to educated readers throughout the colonial world, while his preservation of the Highland language maintained the linguistic precision that gave the original its spiritual power. The subsequent journey of these manuscripts through archives and libraries in Guatemala, Spain, and other locations reflected the complex colonial relationships that governed the preservation and transmission of indigenous knowledge. At various times, the documents faced threats from political upheavals, institutional changes, and simple neglect. Their survival required the intervention of individuals who recognized their value and were willing to take responsibility for their protection. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed a gradual expansion of scholarly and popular interest in the text, as its significance became recognized beyond the original Highland communities where it had been preserved. Translations into major European languages made the document available to readers worldwide, while anthropological and literary studies explored its complex relationships to other indigenous American practices and its contributions to universal human understanding. Yet this broader recognition also raised important questions about the relationship between academic study and indigenous cultural sovereignty. The Highland communities that had preserved their ancestral book through centuries of persecution maintained legitimate claims to ownership and control over their inherited knowledge, even as scholars and translators worked to make that understanding accessible to global audiences. Contemporary Highland leaders have sought to balance respect for their ancestors' achievement in preserving these accounts with recognition that the universal themes embodied in their text can contribute to broader human understanding of our relationship with celestial forces and universal balance. They have supported scholarly work that approaches their practices with appropriate reverence, while insisting that such work must acknowledge and respect the continuing vitality of Highland culture. The modern revival of interest in indigenous knowledge systems has brought new attention to the text's relevance for addressing contemporary challenges that humanity faces in maintaining proper relationship with natural cycles, universal forces, and the sources of life itself. Environmental crises, social fragmentation, and spiritual emptiness in technologically advanced societies have created receptive audiences for ancient understanding that addresses exactly these problems through accounts of universal balance and human responsibility. Educational institutions throughout the Americas now include this text in curricula, designed to help students understand the sophisticated intellectual achievements of pre-Columbian civilizations. These programs emphasize not merely the historical significance of the document, but its continuing relevance as a source of understanding about human nature, relationships with the divine, and the universal principles that govern sustainable existence. Artists, writers, and performers have drawn inspiration from the text's rich imagery and profound themes, developing contemporary works that translate ancient understanding into forms accessible to modern audiences. These creative adaptations help ensure that the essential insights preserved by Highland Guardians continue to influence human consciousness and cultural development. Most importantly, the text continues to serve its original function within Highland communities as a source of spiritual guidance, cultural identity, and connection to the universal balance established by the champion's victory over the forces of arbitrary termination. Ritual recitations still occur during important festivals. Ancestral ball games still invoke the contests that established precedent, and the cycle of agricultural activities still follows patterns that honor the blessed grain from which humanity was shaped. The survival of this extraordinary document through more than 5 centuries of cultural suppression and social transformation demonstrates the power of determined communities to preserve what they value most deeply. The anonymous Highland scribes who risked their lives to create a written record, the guardians who maintained oral transmission despite persecution, the community leaders who revealed their treasures to sympathetic outsiders, and the contemporary protectors who continue to balance preservation with appropriate sharing. All have contributed to ensuring that the understanding embodied in this text remains available to guide and inspire future generations. As humanity faces unprecedented challenges that require insight about our proper relationship with natural cycles, universal forces, and purpose itself, the ancient accounts preserved in this document offer perspectives that remain as relevant today as they were when first recited in the centers of classical Maya civilization. The champion's victory over the arbitrary forces of termination established principles of universal justice that continue to guide those who seek to live in proper harmony with the balance that sustains all life. This text thus stands as both historical monument and living understanding, preserved through the dedication of countless individuals who comprehended that some truths transcend the particular circumstances of their time and place. Its survival ensures that future generations will have access to profound insights about the nature of creativity, human responsibility, and the universal balance that connects all conscious beings in relationships of mutual dependence and shared destiny.